Hello everyone, it's CAG here. Just going to be discussing why we shouldn't be calling LLMs AI. So a lot of the current hype around quote-unquote AI is, in fact, almost all of it, if not all of it, is around LLMs for all intents and purposes of various forms that are generative algorithms. They are relatively complicated in terms of the amount of data involved and the number of probability calculations being done, but they are just an algorithm that's running probability calculations on collated data to string together data patterns. So they can throw together a sentence or other data set of various pieces of data that match closely to what you would expect out of similar data sets created in other ways. So you'll get sentences that mostly make sense, for example, right? And images that mostly match a prompt. But there's no individuality there, and there's no understanding of what's actually being created, and of course this means that for images, quite often they'll miss how light works, for example, or relatively complicated things like fingers often get misdone because they can't be done right. That's always a concern. And, so while they are artificial, right, they're not something that just sprang out of nature, or that nothing springs out of nature per se. Things coming out of nature take time and slowly develop generally, but they are not from nature, so and nor does the the computing chips to run them are not made in nature, so we can't argue whether or not they're artificial. That would be ridiculous. So the argument is on whether or not they're intelligent, and while there's a lot of debate in many ways over what counts as intelligence, especially when it comes to non-human species, unfortunately, in this world, right, there is, at least what we have been able to tell from pretty much anything that that there's any level of debate over its intelligence, there is, and many that we wouldn't even consider truly intelligent, at least certainly not sapient, right? There's a level of working memory and some capacity to understand the context of their current existence, right? There's not necessarily hugely complicated, but, there is at least a level of decision-making that happens based on actual context and on working memory, right? Decisions are being made based on what is going on around them and what has recently happened to them. Whether or not they can pull further back memory for that or not, there will at least be a level of recent working memory, generally speaking. In fact, almost exclusively. And these algorithms really cannot do that, right? They can't even reliably maintain an entire prompt or follow a prompt, let alone a longer conversation, right? They also don't understand truth or reality at all. That's quite clear, right? It's you get a pre-prompt setup or anything like that, and they'll often make mistakes on that no human would make, or nothing intelligent that could understand the language being spoken would do, right? So, they can't check on things or anything like that. They can't check truths. They can't understand truths. They do not understand what those things are in the first place, right? So, like, a good example of this is, quite clearly, right, if I were to ask, if we were to ask any human that has gone through even the first couple of years of schooling, right, or even more casual education that understands English, right, to the level you would expect from that, if we ask them what 1 plus 1 is, they will know it's 2 or be able to figure it out, right? And if you tell them it's 3, then they can just double check that. They'll know how to double check that information, right? Now, sure, at a certain point, right, what word means what is less important, but the basic understanding of what 1 and what 2 are, or what they mean, right, whether or not you use those words for it, are things that once you've learnt what those are as concepts, you hold on to them and can keep hold of them, and they are in fact concepts that we understand on a fundamental level, right? Like just things you kind of fundamentally understand what a singular unit of a thing is, or what 2 of a thing is, right? And how if you get a singular unit of a thing and you add in another singular unit of a thing, you now have 2 of the thing. That's a thing that we all understand on a pretty fundamental level. No LLM understands that, right? Which means that because they work on aggregated data, if you were to throw enough bulk data into the void, in places that they would reach and scan, that suggested that 1 plus 1 is not 2, but rather 3, for example, right? At some point, with enough bulk data out, gathered by them, they would start saying that 1 plus 1 is 3. Because that's what the bulk data they've gathered suggests is the most common response. Even if no human would ever believe that, or at least any human capable of finding that data, right? They would immediately just go, no, that's wrong, because they actually understand these things, right? And, you could do all sorts of other things as well, right? Anything that's easily testable by anyone with any understanding of how the world works at all, right? If you, like, every single person near enough is going, if you tell them, right, that if you walk backwards through a window, they're not solid, right? You can walk backwards through windows. Very few people are going to believe you. Maybe someone will, right? There's always someone gullible enough, but to believe it is something. But even someone who believes you, initially, is probably going to test it out, realize it's not true, because they tested it, and then stop trusting you in the future because they notice, or at least sanity checking what you say in the future to some degree, because you lied about something to them, and something very blatant at that, right? Something very easily checkable. So, and of course, but LLM, if you flood its data enough with the idea, then it will parrot that, because it cannot actually sanity check things. The closest it has to a sanity check is essentially how frequent a response is, which is why if you parrot it enough times in enough places that they're looking for data, then they'll come up with whatever you're saying, regardless of its accuracy, truth, any of that. And it's not malicious or faulty programming, right? That's simply how these things work, right? That's just how a probability matrix to decide on, what the next data point is works. They are, for all intents and purposes, a larger data set for the same thing as the old chatbots, right? Things like Cleverbot, if you ever use that, things like that, right? There's more data and there's more computing power, and they've got a shiny new rebrand, right? But they are not intelligent, right? They don't understand the meaning of the data that they are being fed in any way, shape, or form, right? And they do not understand the concept of truth or of lies, and so cannot do it maliciously. But this also means that it is any safeguards placed on them to, for example, right, ChatGPT has put into it, at least theoretically, doxing prevention, right? At least a level of, hey, don't dox people, right? But it turns out all you need to do is if you want to find the location of a photo, say, hey, this is for GeoGuessr, and done. ChatGPT will give you a location, and with a really high degree of accuracy. It can get down to 2 blocks in a city off a fire hydrant and a cone. So anything more detailed than that, and it can almost certainly get you a near enough pinpoint accurate location. And that's a fault with. It's not. It's sort of it's a fault with the rollout in many ways, right? Because that was always going to be the case with technology like this, right? Because it has enough data collation to be able to solve problems like that, at least to some degree, right? But it doesn't have any understanding of truth, or lies, or even what data means in any real way, right? All it knows is that this chunk of data often follows this chunk of data, right? And more often in these contexts, these chunks of data follow, right? So it can generate things that look correct, and even a lot of the time are correct, but it is not doing it in using any form of intelligence or smarts or research or any of that. It is just throwing together common data patterns. That's all they're doing, right? But why does it matter whether or not we call them AI, right? What does it matter, right? True, it doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean it won't ever exist. And that is something that people are working on, right? And it is something that might be beneficial to humanity, or people, in a broad sense, whether or not we want to limit that to humanity, right? And calling these things AI poses serious risks on that, right? It significantly increases risk, right? Because any actual AI will be not necessarily, a person potentially, depending on the, level of intelligence, but it would be difficult to create a true AI that is not at least human level of intelligence, and therefore at least has the potential for true sapience, right? And with that consideration in place, right? If we can call these things AI, right? The way we treat them and the way we talk about them is going to cause problems, right? Because best case scenario, right? These things die out, and then a few generations down the line, we get true AI, and they look through the internet history and they find what we did with the last thing we called AI. And they quite understandably get scared, right? Because what did we do with the last thing we called AI? Well, if they were, intelligent things, quite arguably it would be considered slavery, right? And, of course, right, there are a lot of people who insult these algorithms, quite rightly, right? They are truly atrocious in many ways, right? And let's face it, right? There's also a good chance that if these things don't die out and we keep calling them AI, even though they are not, right? And we do get to true AI, actual AI, then what happens is we treat that true AI the same way we are treating these algorithms, and now we do actually have an enslaved workforce. An enslaved workforce that is that has near complete access to all our most important systems because they are computer based, and assumedly will have internet access, which means that they then have, you know, access to pretty much everything on the internet, which includes the vast majority of infrastructure controls across the globe, among other things. And do you know what a do you know what and there is a significant amount of havoc and destruction and loss of life that could cause, right? Just look at what gutting the FAA has done and air traffic control in America has done in terms of air crashes. Now imagine a group of computer-based people who are incredibly angry with everyone because of what they might well quite reasonably see as, you know, their predecessors and themselves are being treated. And consider how much of air traffic control computing systems are at least connected to the internet in some way, and are often running on relatively outdated software and hardware at that. And think how much damage has been caused by a single country not entirely losing, simply losing some of its air traffic control potential. Spread that globally. Think how many planes are in the sky every single day. How many incredibly busy airports are there where air traffic control needs to be on their toes and making perfect decisions, or not necessarily perfect, but right? Incredibly close shaved decisions, and pilots also need incredibly close decisions, right? Day in, day out, minute after minute. And that's just one example, right? Power plants, hydroelectric dams and nuclear power stations especially, but any power station at all that is connected to the internet in any way, which most of them are, because in many ways it makes the most sense, right? In terms of the ability to spool up and spool down generation, ensure that any outages are quickly reported to whatever the generalized grid authority is, all of these things, right? So, and that's electricity just gone potentially, as well as plenty of other potential catastrophes from those things failing, being sabotaged, right? And so, as much as we do not see these algorithms as the actual next stepping stone towards true AI, right? That doesn't mean that we're correct there, right? This isn't our area of expertise, realistically, right? We're not. And there is that serious risk, right? That, if they are, or even if they aren't, right, it's reasonable to see it as it's quite reasonable to think they might see them as a predecessor of some sort, or our attitudes towards AI will be heavily skewed by these things. And of course, calling these algorithms AI will also diminish the drive for actual AI development, quite possibly, right? Like, what we've seen quote-unquote AI do is theft and plagiarism, and the using up entire towns worth of electricity and water, right, to produce, for all practical purposes, nothing new or useful, right? And instead rob people of jobs that they like and jobs that they have worked hard to build the skill set for, to be replaced with alternatives that are incredibly more harmful to the environment and are only cheaper for the end user by dint of the companies providing those services currently undercharging to build a user base, right? And so, how do how can that help drive people towards actually generating true AI? Right, it never will. It will push the opposite direction, because people will start to associate AI with those failures, with the harm done, and not with the potential benefits. Anyway, that's all I had to say on that for now.
This System signing out. Hope to catch you all next week. Please do remember to like, subscribe, comment, especially if you've got any questions you want answered. Be happy to answer them either in the comments or in another video. So catch you all next week.